the Sega Genesis. The Sega Genesis is one of the most beloved video game consoles of all time and boasted some of the most memorable video games of the 16-bit generation. Whether you were a fan of Sonic the Hedgehog, Mario's chief rival in those days, or a fan of the system's numerous spaceship shooters or plethora of sports games, the Genesis had something for everyone. Even the Sega Dreamcast, which debuted nearly 10 years after the Genesis, is considered by video game fans to be one of the finest gaming consoles ever created. But what happened with Sega between the Genesis and the Dreamcast? Had they left the console race? Did they decide to focus solely on arcade games during this time span? Actually, Sega developed a 32-bit console that you may have never heard of. I know that, for me, as I loved my brother's Sega Genesis growing up, the Sega Saturn wasn't even in the picture when I decided which next-generation console I wanted to purchase when my Super Nintendo became obsolete. I only had the vaguest memory of some Sega console where I played a demo of Nights into Dreams at Toys R Us, making that game probably one of the first fully 3D games I ever played. Besides that, I never remember anyone I knew owning a Sega Saturn, and I never even thought about owning one. It was only until I began taking an interest in retro gaming that I fall in love with Sega's ill-fated 32-bit console. So what happened? What happened with the Saturn that made it such a non-factor in the 32-bit console race? Well, I believe that the problem dates as far back as the inception of the Genesis. Sega always had poor timing when it came to releasing consoles. The Genesis was released to compete with the Nintendo Entertainment System, and outclassed it in nearly every way, at least in terms of technical specifications. The problem was that Nintendo was already in the process of creating the Super Nintendo, which was released in America just 2 years after the Genesis. The Super Nintendo was superior to the Genesis in every way, with the exception of a slower processor. Sega's faster processor did allow for an increased frame rate in some multi-platform titles, even at the expense of slightly worse graphics and poor quality sound. Likewise, the Saturn was not a console that was created to compete with the PlayStation and Nintendo 64. Despite having developed 3D arcade games since the early 90s, Sega envisioned the Saturn as the ultimate 2D gaming console with only rudimentary 3D capabilities, such as enough to play maybe Virtua Fighter and Virtua Racing. The Saturn was originally designed to run with a single processor, but after seeing Sony's PlayStation and its use of fully 3D graphics, Sega panicked and another CPU was added. This, along with the inclusion of 6 other processors, made the console difficult to develop for, and this can be seen when taking a look at many early platform titles and even many early exclusives. The games tended to have poor frame rates and shoddy 3D graphics. Despite this, the Saturn actually sold very well in Japan thanks to a brilliant marketing campaign involving the exploits of a larger-than-life Sega Saturn, as well as a series of popular Japanese role-playing games that were never released in the West.
Sega Saturn からのプレゼント、三四郎ディスクもついている。Sega Saturn!
At the conclusion of the 32-bit generation of the console race, the Saturn actually outsold the N64 in Japan. So then, if Sega was able to have such success in Japan, what happened in America? Well, the problems began in E3 of 1995. The Saturn was initially scheduled for release on Saturday, September 2nd, 1995, a date which was initially dubbed Saturn Day, when the PlayStation was to launch a week later. Sega, however, attempted a brash marketing stunt by announcing on May 11th, 1995, during their E3 conference, that the console was now available immediately at 4 national retailers: Toys R Us, Babbage's, Software Etc., and Electronics Boutique. This ended up causing more problems for Sega than it solved, really. For starters, Sony was able to undercut the Saturn's price point of $399. Sony announced at the exact same conference that the PlayStation would retail for $299, $100 cheaper than the Saturn. Does that sound familiar to any of you? Also, many of the Saturn's supposed launch titles were not ready by the system's surprise launch. The Saturn only released with about 5 games: Virtua Fighter, Panzer Dragoon, Clockwork Knight, Daytona USA, and Bug. Virtua Fighter is an arcade favorite, but the initial Saturn port was buggy and plagued with frame rate issues. On top of this, Virtua Fighter's blocky, textureless 3D graphics just didn't look all that impressive next to Namco's Tekken, a similar 3D fighting game released exclusively on the Sony PlayStation. Daytona USA is another legendary Sega arcade title, but the initial Saturn port had an abysmal frame rate, low-quality 3D graphics with terrible pop-in, and a letterbox display. Compared to the silky smooth Ridge Racer, another Namco-developed PlayStation exclusive, the Saturn looked woefully underpowered. Re-releases of both Virtua Fighter and Daytona USA fixed the issues that plagued the original games, but by then it was really too little too late. The most critically acclaimed launch title for the Saturn was Panzer Dragoon, an on-rails 3D shooter similar to a fantasy-inspired Star Fox. The music was amazing, as was the art direction, as the team behind Panzer Dragoon really attempted to ooze as much power out of the Saturn as possible. The desert level, with the sandworm, was even quite impressive for its day. Still, Panzer Dragoon, while a quality game, wasn't really a system seller, and most of the games that made the Saturn so popular in Japan were never released in the US thanks to Sega of America's strict 3D-only policy. Bernie Stoller, the president of Sega of America, believed that Western gamers didn't really understand 2D Japanese RPGs, and thus believed that only 3D games would really sell well in America. Thirdly, the Saturn just didn't have a whole lot of third-party support. The console received a few inferior ports of 3D PlayStation games like Tomb Raider, but as time went on, less and less third-party developers supported the console. Many of them were spurned over Sega's poor support for the Sega CD and 32X in addition to the Saturn's surprise launch. Games released later in the Saturn's lifespan did contain better graphics and a higher frame rate that caused fans to wonder if perhaps the Saturn really was more powerful than the original PlayStation if placed in the hands of developers who knew how to work their way around the system's hardware. Sega exclusives such as Panzer Dragoon 2, Burning Rangers, Nights into Dreams, and Virtua Fighter 2 looked just as good, if not better, than anything currently on the PlayStation at that time and really showed what the Saturn was capable of. Still, the Saturn failed to attract a wide audience. It didn't help matters when Stoller announced in E3 of '97 that the Saturn was not our future, leading developers and gamers alike to believe that the Saturn was a dead platform. By 1998, support for the Saturn had all but died out, making room for Sega's next console, the Dreamcast. Despite the system's poor performance in America, Japanese games continued to be released for the console until the year 2000. The Saturn sold only a total of 2 million units in North America across its 3-year lifespan. Though the Saturn never really gained a foothold in the North American market, the console still sports some great titles that are highly regarded by retro gamers and video game collectors alike. These titles include the Panzer Dragoon series, which includes 2 of the best rail shooters ever made, and one of the best role-playing games of that console generation. Nights into Dreams, developed by the creators of Sonic the Hedgehog, never really had the appeal of Sega's famous mascot, but it was the closest thing to a Mario or Sonic title on the Saturn, and had some of the best visuals and music on the console. The Saturn is also the only console that gamers can play Sega arcade classics like Virtua Fighter, Daytona USA, Virtua Cop, and House of the Dead. Many great 2D games were released for the console as well, including a near arcade-perfect rendition of X-Men vs. Street Fighter, and the absolute best home console version of Street Fighter Alpha 3, even beating out the Dreamcast version. These 2 games demonstrated that the console truly was a 2D powerhouse. If you owned a Saturn, let me know what you think in the comments about what you thought of it. What are some of your favorite games, and what would you like to see re-released today?